If you spend any time in spiritual communities, eventually you'll hear the term ego death. And it means exactly what it sounds like, that we must kill or subjugate our egos. The thinking goes that our suffering comes from our illusory sense of self. The self is embodied in the ego. Greed, anger, ignorance come from the ego. Thus, if we kill the ego, if we empty ourselves out completely, eventually we'll be filled with some sort of spiritual awakening. Now, this thinking is problematic for a couple of reasons. First, psychologists tell us that we need our egos, we need some sense of self just to exist in the world. We can't speak, we can't walk across a room, we certainly can't practice the Dharma without an ego. And of course, if we don't practice the Dharma, we'll never realize enlightenment. So, this idea, this concept of ego death is false on its face. More than that, it's not found anywhere in the Buddhist scriptures. Now, Buddhism does have the teaching of non-self, which I've covered in other talks, but that's completely different than the concept of ego death. Non-self is expanding our sense of self to include all sentient beings, seeing the interconnectedness and interpenetration between us and all living things. That's the complete opposite than of destroying our sense of self, destroying our ego. More than that, if we try to destroy the ego, we are creating a very dualistic mode of thinking. We are literally cutting ourselves in half, where I'm here, my ego is there, and we're constantly fighting one another. We are fighting ourselves in the name of some sort of spiritual attainment. Now, of course, if we're not supposed to kill our egos, the question becomes, what are we supposed to do? And the answer is, we have to train them. I'll give you an example. I have a close friend who's a professional dog trainer, and I like to joke that he's ruined dogs for me. The reason being that I go to his house and his dogs are incredibly well behaved. They sit when you tell them to sit. They lie down when you tell them to lie down. You can place food on the table, leave the room, come back, they won't touch it. Now, there's nothing special about these dogs per se. They're just trained. On the other end of the spectrum, I was at an event recently. A couple friends sitting around talking. One of them brought their dog. The dog was untrained. It was running around, barking at people. Not biting anyone, not being vicious, but being a bit of a bother. Eventually, it decided that the best thing to do to get attention was to jump into people's laps so that they would give it pets. And this was fine until the dog started knocking over people's drinks. The drinks fell on the carpet, which I found out later was, I guess, kind of expensive, and it was a whole thing. Now, I want to be exceptionally clear here. The dog in my second example was not a bad dog. It was simply a dog that wasn't trained. And because it lacked training, it created suffering for itself, because it didn't know what it did wrong. It also created suffering for the people around it. Our egos work in exactly the same way. Yes, our ego is the source of greed, anger, and ignorance, but that's not because the ego is bad. It's because the ego lacks training. That's why in Buddhism we have the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, the 5 lay precepts, so that we can train our egos to be well behaved, so that they can end suffering, not cause it for ourselves and others. Of course, we might wonder in the moments when we're struggling with our egos, how do we manifest the right mode of thought so that we can be kind to ourselves and by extension be kind to our ego? Well, the Buddha answers that question in the Sutra on the Upasaka precepts. So I'll read the passage and then I'll give an explanation. World-honored one, how does one cultivate compassionate thought? Good son, An intelligent person deeply perceives that all sentient beings are sunk in the great afflictive sea of birth and death. The Buddha then goes on to say, again, he arouses compassion because he takes sentient beings as his own dear ones, although they are full of grudges and malice. Again, he arouses compassion because he sees sentient beings going astray from the proper path and having no guide. Again, he arouses compassion because he sees sentient beings who lie in the mud of the 5 desires but cannot get out and still indulge themselves. Well, there's some powerful imagery there. We have being stuck in the sea of birth and death, also known as samsara. We have beings stuck in the mud of their desires, indulging themselves. And the fact is, sometimes we are the beings stuck in the mud. We are the beings stuck in samsara. And we can attack ourselves, fight ourselves to try and fix things, and frankly, I don't think that's ever worked for anyone. Or, in our moments of weakness, in the moments where we make mistakes, we can instead choose to treat ourselves with compassion. We can be kind to our egos, and by extension, be kind to ourselves. What would happen if next time we try to sit on the cushion and we don't sit quite as long as we want to? What if instead of thinking, I suck at this, we think, oh, well, I still went pretty long. I'm sure I'll go longer next time. What if next time we're feeling angry towards someone, instead of thinking, I'm failing, instead of getting mad at ourselves for being mad, we simply sat down, gave ourselves a hug, and did some meditative breathing for a little while until we were calm? What would happen, I think, is suddenly the practice would be a lot easier. It would be a lot more fun. We would approach the cushion, we would approach our altar with excitement instead of fear, because instead of punishing ourselves through our spirituality, we'd be enriching and enlivening ourselves. Seeing our mistakes, yes, not turning away from them, but also giving ourselves the room, giving ourselves the compassion to understand that, hey, we're stuck in a difficult situation. We're in the mud. It's going to take a while to get out, to remove the defilements of greed, anger, and ignorance. But we choose to give ourselves the time and the opportunity to do that. And once we learn to treat ourselves with compassion, something wonderful happens. It becomes easier to treat others with compassion as well, because when they make mistakes, we see ourselves in those mistakes. And we understand that if we can change, they can change too. Amitabha.